Hi, and welcome to the video course JavaScript Essentials. My name is Patrick Lohner, and I'll be your instructor on this course. I've been in the IT industry for about 15 years, doing just about everything. I've been training for pretty much the duration of my career, but I've also been involved in network administration, server administration, web development, some programming, worked as a consultant for several years in addition to training. So sort of a jack of all trades, and I've dabbled in many things, JavaScript simply being one of them. Now, the point of this course is not to teach you everything there is to know about JavaScript. That would take a lot longer than the time that we have. But it is to lay the groundwork, to give you the fundamentals, or in other words, the essentials. What do you need to know to further a career as a web developer? Well, you definitely need to know JavaScript. It is the most popular programming language on the internet. It works hand in hand with HTML and CSS to design modern, dynamic, interactive web pages. So in this course, we'll start with just an introduction to JavaScript, understanding some of its history. Then we'll get into some of the core syntax and structure, the various object types that you'll deal with and how to work with those. We'll look at then how JavaScript interacts with the web page through something known as the DOM, the Document Object Model. That's where really the power from JavaScript comes into play. And then we'll talk about libraries, jQuery being the primary library that you can add to JavaScript to make it even easier to perform a lot of the functionality that you are going to require. So as I said, you're not going to hear absolutely everything there is to say about JavaScript. But when you finish this course, you should have enough information to propel you forward in the area of web development. In this chapter, we're going to just go over an introduction to JavaScript, the programming language of the web. And in this first section, we're just going to talk about how JavaScript really has existed from the dawn of the World Wide Web. And it's become really an integral part of virtually every website that you are going to visit. Very closely related with HTML and CSS, such that any web developer needs to get at least an introductory handle on JavaScript. It's going to be very helpful for you as you design your web pages. And so we'll talk about that. JavaScript from the dawn of the web, we call this initial clip. But then we're going to go on and look at getting the right tools. Of course, anytime you're doing any sort of development, having the right tools in your toolbox, if you will, is going to be a very important step. Well, what tools are those for JavaScript? Now, in some cases, they're similar with other tools that you might use to develop the HTML for your web pages or the cascading style sheets to style your web pages. But there are going to be some additional utilities that we will use that we may not use for those other two components. And then we'll go through just creating the first JavaScript program. JavaScript programs may sound very fancy, and in fact, they can get very, very complex, but they can also be very simple. And so we'll go walk through the steps for just introducing JavaScript into the web page so that you can see really at a basic level how very simple it actually is. So JavaScript was a programming and scripting language that was developed about 20 years ago by a man named Brendan Eich, who really never would have thought that it would become what it has become today. And that is that JavaScript is mentioned as the de facto standard assembly of the web. It is virtually impossible to find websites that don't use some form of JavaScript. Now, as soon as I say that, I'm sure we can find static pages that don't introduce this component, but the vast majority of the sites that you find out there will be using JavaScript. It's used not only in browsers and the front end of web applications, but it's also now heavily used on the server side for web application programming interfaces like Node.js. When it was originally introduced, it was not intended to be used for that purpose, but it's become so widespread that we see it on both the client and the server side. It's most commonly thought of as the most popular programming language in existence. And so that's really one of the reasons that it is an essential for a web developer to learn. Well, the first thing that we have to cover here is something about the name of JavaScript. So as soon as we see JavaScript, a lot of times we think, oh yeah, Java. I know about Java because I've got a little pop-up every once in a while that tells me that I need to enable Java or I need to do an update on Java. Java is a Sun Microsystems programming language, and it's actually completely separate from JavaScript. In fact, the two have nothing to do with one another. It is a heavy programming language, that being Java, and it requires the installation of additional software on the system. That's software that does not exist. It's not automatically included in the web browser, and that's why you're receiving the updates. Or if you visit a site that requires Java, you get a link to go and download the most recent update of Java. The makers of JavaScript kind of latched on to free publicity and the buzz that Java was getting back in 1995 and named it JavaScript, but the two are completely different. As we said, this was invented by Brandon Eich in 1995. It became the ECMA standard in 1997. ECMA is just kind of the official name of JavaScript. Most people don't call it that. Technically, the current version is ECMA Script 6, which was released in 2015. The original standard, or the official name, ECMA 262. You don't need to worry about that. That's really just more of a history lesson than anything else. But JavaScript is the programming language of the web. It's distinguished from Java in that it is included, or support for JavaScript is included in all your major web browsers. It is not something that has to be enabled. There is no additional software. These are script elements that can include or that can be included directly in the content of your HTML web pages. And then the script's executed, either when the HTML web page loads or when a certain event happens, such as you clicking a button or selecting an image or typing information into a form or any number of other types of events. So JavaScript is really embedded into those pages and is supported by all your browsers. The primary area in which JavaScript will function is within a host environment like a web browser. It's not the only place, but it is by far the most common. So we are going to be dealing with JavaScript entirely in conjunction with web browsing, with HTML pages, and with CSS styling. But it is possible now to use JavaScript in other programs like Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Acrobat, NoSQL databases. Those are pretty popular as well. And so, as I said at the beginning, it's not only a client-side language, it also has to do with server-side application programming interfaces as well. It's primarily, though, a client-side scripting language. And that means that most of the code for JavaScript is written directly into the HTML page. When the page is rendered to the client, that code is parsed, just like the HTML elements, just like the CSS styling rules. As the HTML defines the structure and the content of the page, the CSS defines the style, the JavaScript will define the interactivity. What does the web page do? How does it respond to user-related events? That's what JavaScript is all about. Otherwise, you would have basically a static page. It doesn't mean the page isn't useful. It just means it can't respond to anything. What's there is there. And so when we deal with dynamic types of web pages, whether it's a photo that changes automatically, whether it is something that comes across the screen, customer reviews maybe that circulate. So I've got a little customer review box and every 10 seconds there's a new review that pops up. Any and all of that is JavaScript. It is what makes the web interactive. It is what makes the web dynamic. So exactly what can JavaScript do for you? Well, this is just an introduction, so we can't possibly list all of the things that it can do for you. But here are a few examples. The other thing I would caution you at this point is don't necessarily worry about not knowing what all of this is, not understanding the particular syntax. That's what we're going to spend the entire course going over. At the end of this course, you're going to be able to write basic JavaScript for your web pages to add a level of interactivity. By the end of the course, you'll understand what each of these mean, even though you may not understand them now. So first, JavaScript can modify the content of the page, that is the HTML content. The page is represented by the word document in JavaScript. So we have this document dot and then various methods. Well, one of the most common methods in JavaScript is the GetElementById method. Kind of assuming at this point that most of you have at least some basic level of knowledge about HTML, a basic level of knowledge about CSS as well. I hope you do. If you don't, you can check out the other courses on those particular topics. These three components go hand in hand. Okay? You've got to know HTML to be able to work with CSS and to be able to work with JavaScript. If you don't have HTML, then JavaScript and CSS, I can say they're worthless, but it's pretty close. So you want to have that fundamental knowledge. Okay, so I'm not trying to go off on a rabbit trail, but what is an ID? Well, I'm kind of assuming everybody knows what an ID is. In HTML, you can define tags as being associated with a particular ID. And so say I have a div tag on an HTML page. And then I say div and then ID equals and in quotations a name that I have used to identify that particular div, to distinguish it from the other divs that are on the page. Okay? Well, that's where document.getElementById comes in. You're saying to JavaScript, look at the current document and then get this particular element, in this case, an element that has the ID of demo. Okay? Then we will access a particular property, and that property is inner HTML. Inner HTML would allow me to view the HTML for that particular element, or it would allow me to change the HTML for that particular element. So this statement here is actually changing that. Document.getElementById, demo is the element that I want to focus on, and then I want to access the inner HTML, but I don't just want to view it. Notice we're setting equals, that's an assignment operator. And so we're setting it equals to a string, hello JavaScript. Okay? If we were to execute that code, it would look through the page, parse the page, locate a div element named demo, or given the ID of demo, and then modify the HTML to say, hello JavaScript. The second option, we can use JavaScript to change HTML attributes. So here we have an example of an image. We're declaring a variable, that's the var keyword. So var image equals, and then we're right back at document.getElementById, only this time I'm looking for an element named image, or given the ID of image. I'm then going to change the source of that image. So notice then we use the variable .source, a property, and we modify that property. And we point it at newimage.jpg. Okay? Now that can happen on page load. That can happen after a certain amount of time, which would be a common way of doing it. That can happen when I click the image. So we can create a JavaScript element that will, when the image is selected, modify the image source and change the image. Another option is to change HTML styles through CSS. We know CSS is the styling language of the web. HTML defines the structure and content. CSS does things like defining the font weight, the color, the family, border types, shadows, position of the element on the page, and many, many more. Well, we can use JavaScript to make modifications not only to HTML, but also to CSS. Here again, we have document.getElementById. We're looking for an element that has the ID of demo. Then we're accessing the style property, and we're changing the font size. And the font size is now going to be equal to 25 pixels. Okay? And so we are increasing the font size, once again, using an assignment operator. We can also validate the data input into forms. This is a very, very common way of using JavaScript. We can make sure that somebody actually puts in a valid telephone number or a valid email address. Now, you're not actually checking the validity of the email address per se. It's not sending an email to see if the person responds, but it's looking for a particular format, name, @ domain name, something like that. It can also just validate that there is anything in the form at all. So we can have a form, and if somebody leaves a required field blank, JavaScript can pop up a message that says username is required, for instance. All right, and so we can do those things as well. These are very, very popular ways of using JavaScript. They're certainly not the only ways that you can use it, but these are all things that we are going to end up going through and seeing exactly how this is done.